They are 7 young men who conquered the entire world with nothing but raw talent, unbreakable brotherhood, and a dream that nobody believed in. BTS. But behind those million-dollar smiles, behind the sold-out stadiums and record-breaking albums, there are wounds that no amount of fame could ever heal. What happens when the people closest to you become the ones who cut the deepest? What happens when trust turns into betrayal and love turns into a headline? Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on 7 shocking stories that shook the BTS universe to its core. 7 women who left scars on the hearts of Bangtan's beloved members. Some of these names will surprise you. Some of these stories have never been told this way before. And trust me, number 1, that one will leave you absolutely speechless. Did a famous actress publicly humiliate one member on live television? Did a well-known interviewer cross a line so far that millions of armies demanded an apology? And what about the woman whose actions were so painful that even the members themselves couldn't hold back their tears? Buckle up, because this isn't just a list. This is a journey through heartbreak, resilience, and the untold emotional battles that made BTS who they are today. Are you ready? Let's get into it, starting from number 7.
Number 7. J-Hope. The smile that hit 1,000 cuts, the fan sign that broke him. You know what's crazy? Out of all 7 members of BTS, if there's one person who has literally dedicated his entire existence to making everyone around him happy, it's Young Hoseok, the man the world knows as J-Hope. This is the guy who earned his stage name because he genuinely wanted to be a source of hope for fans. Not as a marketing strategy, not as a concept, but as a real, breathing philosophy that he carried in his chest every single day since BTS debuted on June 13, 2013, under Big Hit Entertainment, a company so small at the time that the boys had to share a single cramped apartment and take turns eating meals because the budget simply wasn't there. J-Hope was the mood maker from day one. If you've ever watched any BTS behind-the-scenes content, any Run BTS episode, any Bangtan Bomb, you already know, this man radiates energy like a human sun. His laugh is contagious. His dance moves are so sharp they could cut glass. He literally trained in street dance at a Gwangju academy called Neuron before joining Big Hit, winning local dance battles as a teenager and building a reputation as one of the most promising young poppers in the underground scene. When he entered the trainee system, he wasn't just some random kid chasing a dream. He was a skilled performer who gave up a promising solo dance career because he believed in the group's vision. He believed in Bangtan. And more importantly, he believed in the fans. So imagine this. Imagine being that person, someone who pours every ounce of their soul into bringing joy to others, someone who literally chose a name that means hope, and then sitting down at a fan sign event, face to face with a person you think is there to support you, only to hear the words, "I don't like you. You're my least favorite member. I'm only here for someone else." That's not a hypothetical scenario. That actually happened. Multiple times. And it happened to J-Hope specifically more than almost any other member during BTS's early to mid-career period, roughly between 2013 and 2016. When the group was still clawing their way up from the bottom of the K-pop hierarchy. During this era, BTS held regular fan sign events, intimate fan meetings where each ticket holder could sit across from the members one by one, exchange a few words, get an album signed, and share a brief personal moment. These events were supposed to be beautiful. They were supposed to be the bridge between idol and fan. But for J-Hope, some of those moments became something else entirely, moments of quiet devastation that he had to swallow with a smile because the cameras were always rolling and the next fan was always waiting. There are multiple fan-recorded accounts, documented on social media, discussed extensively across platforms like Twitter, Weverse, Pan, and Nate, where female attendees at these fan signs would sit in front of J-Hope and either completely ignore him, slide their album across the table without making eye contact, or worse, openly tell him that they were only there for another member and didn't consider him important. Some would skip conversation with him entirely and crane their necks to look at the member sitting next to him. Others would offer gifts and heartfelt letters to every single member at the table, except him. And the most painful part? He noticed. Every single time. If you go back and watch the fan cams from those early fansign events, and they're still circulating online to this day, you can actually see the shift in his expression. The way his smile tightens just slightly. The way his eyes lose a fraction of their sparkle for half a second before he forces himself to recover. He never snapped. He never called anyone out. He never made a scene. He just absorbed it. Quietly. Professionally. The way he always did. But the emotional toll was real, and it didn't stay hidden forever. In a 2015 log, a personal video diary that BTS members occasionally recorded and uploaded for fans, J-Hope opened up in a way that stunned the entire fandom. He didn't name names. He didn't point fingers. But he talked about the weight of feeling unwanted, about wondering whether he truly belonged, about questioning whether the group would be better off without him. The rawness of that confession hit armies like a freight train. Here was their sunshine, their hope, their endless source of energy, sitting alone in a dimly lit room, speaking into a camera with red-rimmed eyes, admitting that the constant rejection from certain fans had genuinely made him doubt his own value. And this wasn't just about hurt feelings in a passing moment. This was about identity. J-Hope had tied his entire sense of purpose to being someone who uplifts others. When the very people he was trying to uplift turned around and told him he wasn't good enough, it didn't just sting, it shook the foundation of who he believed himself to be. The K-pop industry has a brutal internal culture of ranking members by popularity, and during those early years, J-Hope consistently found himself near the bottom of Korean popularity polls, despite being arguably the most technically skilled dancer in the group and a key contributor to the team's on-stage energy. International fans recognized his talent earlier, but domestically, the bias against him was palpable and persistent. Female solo stans known in Korean fan culture as Aki fans were particularly ruthless. These weren't casual listeners. These were people who were deeply embedded in the fandom, but who viewed BTS not as a group, but as a vehicle for their one favorite member. And in that worldview, J-Hope was just an obstacle. Just someone taking up screen time that could have gone to their bias. The psychological warfare was subtle but relentless, online ranking manipulations, deliberately excluding him from fan-made content, mass commenting negative opinions about his visuals or his voice, and yes, those face-to-face fansign confrontations that left marks invisible to the eye but deeply felt in the heart. What makes this story even more profound is what happened next. J-Hope didn't quit. He didn't retreat. He didn't let the bitterness win. Instead, he doubled down. He trained harder. He danced longer. He smiled wider. He released his solo mixtape, Hope World, in 2018, debuting at number 63 on the Billboard 200, the highest charting album by a Korean solo artist at that time, and proved to the entire world that his talent was never the question. The question was always whether people were willing to see it. Years later, when BTS had ascended to global superstardom and J-Hope had firmly established himself as one of the most respected performers in the industry, the narrative finally shifted. The same fan communities that once overlooked him began celebrating him. The fansign cruelty became a cautionary tale, reminder of how careless words can wound even the brightest souls. But here's the thing, J-Hope never asked for an apology. He never demanded vindication. He just kept being Hope. And honestly, that might be the most heartbreaking part of all, the fact that, even after everything, his first instinct was still to give, still to shine, still to heal. But if you think this story was painful, wait until you hear what's coming next, because number 6 involves a member who was publicly reduced to nothing more than a pretty face by a woman whose words echoed across an entire broadcast, and the silence that followed was deafening. Number 6. Jean, the pretty face insult that cut deeper than anyone realized, a talent buried under looks. Let's talk about something that the K-pop industry has been guilty of for decades, but rarely gets called out for: the weaponization of beauty against the very people who possess it. And no one in BTS has experienced this particular brand of cruelty more consistently, more relentlessly, and more painfully than Kim Seokjin, the eldest member of the group, known globally as Jean. Born on December 4th, 1992, in Gwacheon, Gyeonggi Province, Jin didn't originally plan to become a K-pop idol. He was a theater and film major at Konkuk University, one of the most respected private universities in South Korea, with serious aspirations in acting. The story of how he ended up in BTS is practically the stuff of legend. A big-hit entertainment casting manager spotted him stepping off a bus near his university campus and was so struck by his appearance that he chased him down the street to offer him an audition. That moment, as cinematic as it sounds, would become both the greatest blessing and the most persistent curse of Jin's entire career. Because from that day forward, the narrative around Kim Seokjin was set in stone before he ever had a chance to define it himself. He was the visual. That's it. That was his box. In the rigid hierarchy of K-pop group roles, every member is assigned a position: main vocalist, lead dancer, main rapper, visual. And while every position carries weight, the visual tag comes loaded with an unspoken implication that has haunted Jin for over a decade. The implication that you're there because of how you look, not because of what you can do. And the women who reinforced that narrative the hardest weren't strangers on the internet. They were professional broadcasters, television hosts, variety show MCs who sat across from him under studio lights and said the quiet part out loud. During BTS's early and middle career, roughly spanning 2014 to 2017, the group made countless appearances on Korean variety programs and music shows as part of their relentless promotional schedule. These appearances were critical for building public awareness, and the members were expected to be charming, funny, and engaging while navigating conversations led by seasoned hosts who controlled the flow. For most members, these moments were opportunities to showcase personality. For Jin, they often became a minefield. There's a specific pattern that armies have documented extensively over the years, compiling clips and timestamps with the meticulous precision of forensic analysts. The pattern goes like this. A female MC introduces BTS, runs through the members, and when she gets to Jin, the comment is almost always some variation of, so you're the handsome one. Delivered with a tone that sounds complimentary on the surface, but carries an undercurrent of dismissal so sharp you can almost hear it whistle. What follows is usually worse. The MC will then turn to the other members and ask about their latest album, their creative process, their songwriting contributions, their dance training regimen. Substantive questions. Questions that acknowledge artistry. And then she'll circle back to Jin and ask something like, so, with a face like that, do you even need to practice? Or, you must get a lot of love calls from actresses, right? Or, perhaps most devastatingly, she'll simply skip him entirely, moving from one member to the next as if Jin's contribution to the group's actual music is so negligible that it doesn't warrant airtime. One particularly well-remembered incident occurred on a Korean variety broadcast where a female host openly laughed while suggesting that Jin's role in the group was essentially to stand there and be handsome while the others did the heavy lifting. She framed it as a joke. The studio audience laughed. The other hosts chuckled along. And Jin, because he has always been the king of deflecting pain with humor, smiled, made a self-deprecating quip about his worldwide handsome persona, and moved on. But if you watch that clip carefully, if you slow it down and really look at his eyes in the 2 seconds after the laughter dies down, there's a flicker. A micro-expression. The kind of thing you only notice when you know what you're looking for, and armies, who have spent years studying every frame of their idols' public lives, noticed it immediately. The thing that makes this so deeply unfair is that Jin was never just a face. Not even close. By the time these dismissive comments were being broadcast to millions of viewers, Jin had already spent years training his vocals from the ground up. Unlike some members who entered Big Hit with pre-existing musical backgrounds, Jin had virtually no formal vocal training before becoming a trainee. He started essentially from zero, and he worked. Relentlessly. Obsessively. He would practice alone in the studio late at night after the other members had gone to sleep. He took vocal lessons on his own time, studied breath control, expanded his range note by painstaking note. By 2016, his vocals on tracks like Awake from the Wings album demonstrated a level of emotional depth and technical control that silenced anyone who was actually paying attention. That song, written as a deeply personal reflection on his feelings of inadequacy within the group, contained lyrics that essentially said, "I know I can't fly like you, but I'm going to try anyway." The subtext was unmistakable. Jin was singing directly to the narrative that had been built around him, the narrative that said he was decoration rather than substance, and he was answering it not with anger, but with raw, trembling vulnerability. And yet, despite that musical growth, despite his increasingly powerful live performances, despite his songwriting credits and his ability to command a stadium with a single held note, the just a visual label persisted, and female MCs on broadcast television continued to reinforce it with casual, almost reflexive dismissiveness. It's worth pausing here to analyze why this matters beyond just hurt feelings. When a professional broadcaster, someone whose words carry the weight of institutional media, reduces an artist to their appearance on national television, it doesn't just affect that one person in that one moment. It sets a public narrative. It gives permission to millions of viewers to adopt the same reductive lens. It tells aspiring artists who happen to be attractive that their looks will always overshadow their work, no matter how hard they try. And for Jin specifically, it created a psychological battle that he fought quietly for years. The constant tension between being grateful for the visual praise that gave him his initial opportunity and being devastated that the same praise had become a ceiling he couldn't break through. The emotional weight of this became publicly visible during BTS's later years, particularly in behind-the-scenes content where Jin would occasionally drop his comedic mask and speak with startling honesty about feeling like he had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to be taken seriously. In one memorable V-Live broadcast, he told fans that he sometimes worried he was dragging the group down because people perceived him as the member with the least to contribute musically. The chat exploded with protests and reassurances, but the fact that he felt that way at all, after years of growth, after albums that showcased his voice beautifully, after concerts where he sang with the kind of conviction that makes your chest physically ache, tells you everything you need to know about how deep those casual TV comments had cut. The women who made those remarks probably forgot about them within hours. For Jin, they became part of an internal monologue that took years to quiet. What makes Jin's story ultimately triumphant is that he refused to accept the box. His 2022 solo single, The Astronaut, co-written with Coldplay, debuted at number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100. His vocal performance on BTS's later discography, tracks like Epiphany, Moon, and Yours earned him recognition from music critics who had previously overlooked him entirely. He proved, slowly and methodically, and without ever publicly attacking the people who doubted him, that beauty and talent are not mutually exclusive. But he should never have had to prove that in the first place. And the fact that it was often women in positions of media power who forced him into that defensive posture, women who, of all people, should have understood what it feels like to be reduced to your appearance, adds a layer of irony so thick you could choke on it. Now, if Jin's story made you uncomfortable, if it made you reconsider how quickly we categorize people based on surface-level impressions, hold that feeling. Because number 5 involves a member whose encounter with a particular woman wasn't just dismissive, it was so publicly humiliating that the footage went viral, and the internet's reaction was nothing short of explosive. Number 5. Suga. The producer whose entire legacy was erased in one sentence, "You're just an idol." Before Min Youngi ever stood on a BTS stage, before the world knew him as Suga, before he became August D and dropped mixtapes so raw they made the entire Korean music industry sit up straight, he was a skinny, pale kid from Daegu with second-hand equipment and a dream that everyone around him called ridiculous. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. But the cut that went deepest, the wound that festered longest and shaped the fire behind every single bar he's ever spit, that came from a space he never expected. Not from a rival rapper. Not from a faceless internet troll. but from women who sat behind broadcast desks, held microphones, and carried the authority of mainstream media, women who looked him dead in the eye and told him, in one form or another, that nothing he created was real. To understand why this particular form of disrespect broke something inside Min Youngi, you have to go back to where it all started, and it started in pain. Youngi grew up in a lower-income family in Daegu, South Korea's fourth largest city, but a cultural world away from Seoul's entertainment epicenter. His parents weren't wealthy. Resources were scarce. And yet, somewhere in his early teens, Youngi discovered hip-hop, specifically the work of Epic High and Stony Skunk, and something clicked inside him with the force of a deadbolt locking into place. This wasn't a passing hobby. This was purpose. By the time he was 15, he was already producing beats, writing lyrics, and performing as an underground rapper under the name Gloss in Daegu's small, but fiercely passionate hip-hop scene. He taught himself MIDI composition. He worked part-time jobs, including a grueling stint as a delivery rider, to pay for studio time that he couldn't afford. During one of those delivery shifts, he was hit by a car and suffered a serious shoulder injury that would plague him for years. He didn't tell his company. He didn't tell his members. He just kept working because to Min Youngi, stopping meant dying, not physically, but creatively, spiritually, in every way that mattered to him. When he auditioned for Big Hit Entertainment in 2010 and was selected as a trainee, it wasn't because he wanted to be an idol. Let's be absolutely clear about that. He wanted to be a producer. He wanted to make music. Big Hit, at that time, was a struggling company run by Bang Si-hyuk, a respected but commercially limited producer, and the trainee system was Youngi's pathway to professional production resources he could never access on his own. The idol part was the price of admission. He paid it, but he never forgot what he actually came to do. And what he did was extraordinary. Even before BTS's debut in 2013, Youngi was deeply involved in the group's musical DNA. He didn't just perform the songs, he helped build them from the ground up. He wrote lyrics, composed melodies, arranged tracks, and sat in production meetings with a level of seriousness that sometimes startled the company staff. By BTS's middle era, his fingerprints were on virtually every major release. His production credits are staggering, over 150 songs credited to his name across BTS's discography and external projects. He produced tracks for artists like Halsey, Juice WRLD, IU, and PSY. His August D mixtape trilogy, August D in 2016, D2 in 2020, and D-Day in 2023, collectively represented one of the most ambitious and critically acclaimed solo projects in K-pop history, with D-Day debuting at number 2 on the Billboard 200. This man wasn't playing at being a musician. He was one in the most complete, undeniable, receipts on the table sense of the word. So imagine carrying all of that sacrifice, all of those sleepless nights in the studio, all of those beats crafted from nothing, all of that pain converted into poetry. And then sitting across from a female television host during a promotional broadcast who tilts her head, smiles that practiced broadcast smile, and asks, "So, your company writes all your songs, right? It must be nice to just perform what's handed to you." The silence that followed, according to fans who documented the moment and dissected it frame by frame across social media, lasted maybe 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, you could see something cross Min Youngi's face that wasn't anger, it was something worse. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire adult life building something with his bare hands only to be told, casually, offhandedly, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, that the building wasn't his. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and it was devastating specifically because of how systematic it felt. Throughout BTS's promotional appearances on Korean variety and music shows between 2014 and 2018, multiple female MCs and interviewers operated under the assumption, sometimes stated explicitly, sometimes implied through the questions they chose to ask and the questions they chose not to ask, that BTS's music was a corporate product assembled by behind-the-scenes songwriters and producers at the company. The members were performers. Puppets. Pretty faces executing someone else's vision. And when this assumption collided with Suga specifically, the member who had literally bled for his craft, who had sacrificed his physical health, his financial stability, and his relationship with his own family to pursue music, the impact was categorically different from how it hit the other members. For Suga, being called just an idol wasn't just inaccurate. It was an erasure. It took the most sacred part of his identity, his artistry, his production work, the thing he valued above fame, above money, above everything. And it deleted it from the public record with a single careless sentence delivered by someone who hadn't bothered to do even 5 minutes of research before the cameras rolled. The gendered dimension of this makes it even more layered. The Korean entertainment industry's variety show circuit is heavily populated by female MCs and hosts, many of whom are former idols or actresses themselves, women who understand intimately what it feels like to be underestimated, to have your work ethic questioned, to be treated as a product rather than a person. And yet, some of these same women perpetuated the exact same reductive framework against BTS's members, particularly against the rap line, whose creative contributions were the easiest to overlook if you weren't paying attention. Youngie addressed this pain directly in his music, because that's what Youngie does. He doesn't give interviews about his feelings, he writes songs about them. The last, a track from his first August D mixtape released in 2016, contained lyrics so unflinchingly honest about his struggles with depression, self-doubt, and the feeling of being perpetually invalidated that it became a landmark moment in K-pop, one of the first times a mainstream idol had spoken this openly about mental health in a genre that traditionally demanded perfection and silence. In Daechwita, the lead single from D2, the symbolism was impossible to miss. Youngie literally portrayed two versions of himself at war, the idol and the artist, the image and the reality. And the entire visual narrative was about the authentic self overthrowing the manufactured perception. He was telling the world, and specifically, he was telling every person who had ever dismissed him as just an idol that the mask was never the real face. The real face was the one in the studio at 3 a.m, hunched over a keyboard, chasing a melody that nobody else could hear yet. What's particularly devastating about Suga's experience is how long it took for the mainstream Korean media to correct its own narrative. It wasn't until BTS achieved undeniable global dominance, Grammy nominations, United Nations speeches, Billboard records, that the same broadcast ecosystem that had dismissed Youngie's artistry began retroactively celebrating it. Suddenly, the same networks were running segments about BTS's self-produced music as if it were a newly discovered fact rather than something that had been true since day one. And Youngie, to his credit, never gloated. He never pointed back to those old clips and said, "See? I told you." He simply kept producing, kept writing, kept creating. But in rare moments of candor and behind-the-scenes footage, in late-night V-Lives, in the quiet spaces between the performances, you could catch glimpses of the scar tissue. The way he'd pause when someone praised his production and look genuinely surprised, as if some part of him still couldn't fully believe that people recognized it. The way he'd deflect compliments about his songwriting with a shrug and a mumbled, "I just did my job," as if years of being told his job didn't exist had made him afraid to claim it too loudly. Min Youngie turned his pain into platinum records. He turned dismissal into discography. He turned every "you're just an idol" into a bar so sharp it drew blood. But he should never have been put in the position of having to prove his own authorship over his own art. The women who made those comments probably moved on to the next interview, the next guest, the next scripted question. For Youngie, those words became fuel, but fuel that burned from a wound that never fully closed. And speaking of wounds that never fully closed, number 4 involves a member who didn't just face dismissal or disrespect from a woman in the media. This one is far. Number 4, Jungkook, loved to death by the women who claimed to adore him when obsession replaced affection. Here's a question that sounds like a paradox until you've lived it. What happens when the love that built you becomes the cage that traps you? What happens when the very women who stream your music, buy your albums, scream your name in stadiums across 6 continents, and tattoo your lyrics onto their skin? What happens when some of those same women decide that loving you means owning you? Jungkook knows the answer. And it's not a pretty one. Born September 1st, 1997, in Busan, South Korea, Jungkook was barely 15 years old when BTS debuted in June 2013. 15. Let that number sit with you for a second. While most kids his age were stressing about high school exams and figuring out who they were, Jungkook was already standing on a stage in front of cameras, performing choreography that would make seasoned dancers sweat, and singing with a vocal tone so naturally rich that industry veterans were calling him a generational talent before he even graduated from adolescence. He was the golden magne, the youngest member of the group who happened to be absurdly gifted at virtually everything he tried, from singing to dancing to drawing to filming to athletics. The nickname wasn't hyperbole. It was observation. But here's the thing about growing up in front of millions of eyes: you don't just grow up. You grow up under surveillance. And for Jungkook, that surveillance didn't come from big hits management or from the Korean media establishment or even from the industry's notoriously controlling trainee system. It came from women. Specifically, it came from a subset of female fans who crossed the line between admiration and obsession so completely, so aggressively, and so persistently that they redefined what it means to be a fan, and not in a good way. They're called saesyeongs. The word comes from the Korean term ese, meaning private, and sang, meaning life, literally, private life. And that's exactly what these women targeted. Jungkook's private life. His personal space. His freedom. His right to exist as a human being outside the spotlight. The documented incidents are staggering in both their volume and their audacity. Female saesyeongs obtained Jungkook's personal phone number, not once, not twice, but repeatedly over the course of several years, and bombarded him with calls and messages at all hours of the day and night. We're not talking about a fan finding a celebrity's number and sending a polite "I love your music" text. We're talking about hundreds of calls. Relentless. Intrusive. Inescapable. Jungkook changed his number multiple times, and each time, within weeks or even days, the saesyeongs would obtain the new one through leaked databases, bribed insiders, or social engineering tactics sophisticated enough to make a cybersecurity expert nervous. They booked seats next to him on flights. This is documented. There are multiple instances where Jungkook boarded a plane for a private schedule or a personal trip, only to find that a female saesyeong had somehow discovered his flight information, purchased a seat in the same row, and positioned herself directly beside him for the duration of the journey. Imagine that. Imagine being trapped in an aluminum tube at 35,000 feet with someone who has been stalking your movements with the precision of a military intelligence operation, and you can't leave, can't move, can't do anything except sit there and endure it while pretending everything is fine because making a scene would generate headlines that would hurt your group. They showed up at his residence. Not at the big hit building, which at least had security protocols. At his actual home. Female saesyeongs were caught on CCTV cameras lurking outside his apartment building in Seoul, waiting for hours, sometimes in freezing weather, sometimes in the middle of the night, just to catch a glimpse of him entering or leaving. Some attempted to enter the building itself. Some left gifts at his door, packages containing personal items, letters with disturbingly intimate content, objects that blurred the line between devotion and threat. Jungkook was forced to move residences multiple times due to saesyeong harassment, each relocation representing not just a logistical inconvenience, but a psychological defeat, the acknowledgement that his own home, the one place in the world where he should have felt safe, had been compromised by women who believed their love entitled them to access. But the saesyeong invasion was only half the story. The other half, and arguably the more emotionally devastating half, came from a different category of female fans entirely. Not stalkers. Not criminals. Just ordinary fans whose reaction to Jungkook living a normal life became so disproportionately vicious that it fundamentally altered his relationship with the concept of personal freedom. The most infamous flashpoint occurred in September 2019, when Korean media outlet Dispatch published CCTV footage and photographs of Jungkook spending time in Itaewon, one of Seoul's most popular nightlife and social districts, with a woman who was later identified as a tattoo artist associated with a studio he frequented. The footage showed nothing scandalous. Nothing inappropriate. Two people walking down a street, entering an establishment, existing in public space the way any 21-year-old on the planet has the right to exist. But the reaction from a segment of BTS's female fanbase was volcanic. Within hours of the footage surfacing, Korean online communities Nate Pan, Insties, The Coup, erupted with posts from female fans expressing not concern, not curiosity, but fury. The language was revealing. They wrote about feeling betrayed. They wrote about feeling cheated on. They used the vocabulary of romantic relationships to describe their parasocial connection to a man who didn't know their names, as if Jungkook's decision to spend an evening with a friend was a violation of some unspoken contract that he had never signed. Some demanded a public apology, not from Dispatch for invading his privacy, from Jungkook for having the audacity to have a personal life. The tattoo artist herself became a target. Female fans flooded her social media with hate comments, death threats, and demands that she stay away from Jungkook. Her business was review bombed. Her personal accounts were doxed. A woman whose only crime was existing in the same physical space as a famous man was subjected to a coordinated harassment campaign orchestrated almost entirely by other women. Women who claimed to love the very person whose happiness they were actively destroying. Big Hit Entertainment eventually released a statement confirming that Jungkook and the tattoo artist were simply friends who had met through mutual acquaintances, and that no further comment was necessary because, and this part was implicit but unmistakable, it was none of the public's business. But the damage was done. Not to Jungkook's career, BTS was far too massive at that point for a manufactured scandal about a 21-year-old hanging out with a friend to make a commercial dent. The damage was to Jungkook himself, to his willingness to exist openly, to his trust in the people who were supposed to be his support system. In the months following the Itaewon incident, fans who tracked Jungkook's social media activity and public appearances noted a visible shift. He became more guarded. His V-Lives, once spontaneous, loose, filled with the unfiltered energy of a young man who genuinely enjoyed talking to his fans, became less frequent and more measured. He smiled the same smile, but there was a new layer behind it, a wariness, a calculation, a constant awareness that any moment of authentic living could be captured, distorted, and weaponized against him by the same community that sang along to Euphoria, with tears streaming down their faces. In a later interview, Jungkook reflected on the nature of fame with a maturity that belied his age. He didn't name the incident specifically, but he spoke about the difficulty of reconciling two truths that existed simultaneously, the truth that armies were the reason BTS existed and the source of unimaginable joy, and the truth that some of those same armies had become the source of his deepest anxieties. "I want to be a good person for the people who support me," he said, choosing his words with the careful precision of someone who knew every syllable would be dissected. "But sometimes I wonder if being a good person means not being a person at all." That sentence, quiet, restrained, almost casual in its delivery, contained more pain than most people could articulate in 1,000 words. It was the sound of a young man realizing that the women who claimed to love him the most were the same women who punished him the hardest for being human. Jungkook went on to release his solo album, Golden, in November 2023, featuring the global smash hit Standing Next to You, which debuted at number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. He had grown, matured, and emerged from the chaos with his talent fully intact and his spirit, though scarred, unbroken. But the scars are there. They're in the way he hesitates before sharing personal details. They're in the way he chooses his words when talking about relationships. Number 3, RM. The translator who had to swallow every insult twice. The interview that stripped his dignity. There's a specific kind of loneliness that only Kim Namjoon understands. It's not the loneliness of being alone. He's never been alone. Not really. Not since 7 boys from different corners of South Korea were thrown together in a cramped practice room and told to become something extraordinary. It's the loneliness of being the only one in the room who fully understands what's being said, and knowing that what's being said is disrespectful, reductive, and deliberately demeaning, and having to stand there, smile, translate, and respond with grace while every cell in your body is screaming at you to fight back. That was RM's reality during BTS's American media blitz between 2017 and 2019. A period that should have been nothing but triumph, but was instead punctuated by moments of humiliation so subtle that only RM caught them in real time, because only RM spoke fluent English. Let's establish something that the international public often misunderstands about BTS's relationship with the English-speaking media world. When BTS first began appearing on American television and radio in 2017, following their explosive performance at the American Music Awards that November, the landscape was completely unprepared for them. Not because a K-pop group had never tried to break into the Western market, others had, with varying degrees of success, but because no one expected it to actually work. Not like this. Not at this scale. Not with a group that sang primarily in Korean. The American entertainment media, with its deeply ingrained monolingual bias, didn't know what to do with BTS. And rather than doing the journalistic homework required to ask intelligent questions about the group's music, their creative process, their cultural significance, or the unprecedented global movement they had catalyzed, many female interviewers and hosts defaulted to the path of least resistance. They asked about girls. Over and over and over again. So, do you guys have girlfriends? Who's your celebrity crush? If you could date any American celebrity, who would it be? Which member is the best flirt? These weren't icebreaker questions sprinkled into otherwise substantive interviews. For many female hosts, particularly on morning shows, entertainment news programs, and radio segments, these were the entire interview. The full intellectual bandwidth allocated to 7 artists who had written albums exploring themes of mental health, societal pressure, generational identity. And the philosophy of self-love was reduced to giggling inquiries about which Hollywood actress they found attractive. And every single one of those questions landed on Namjoon's shoulders first. Because he was the translator. The bridge. The only member who could process the question in its original language with all its tonal nuances, its undercurrent of condescension, its implicit framing of BTS as a novelty act rather than a legitimate musical force. The other 6 members would hear the question in Korean filtered through Namjoon's translation, softened by his instinct to protect them from the full weight of the dismissal, and respond accordingly. But Namjoon heard everything. Twice. First in English, raw and unfiltered. Then again in Korean, as he reconstructed the question in a way that wouldn't make his brothers feel small. Imagine that cognitive and emotional labor. Imagine sitting on a couch under studio lights, surrounded by cameras broadcasting to millions, and hearing a female host lean forward with that particular smile, the one that says, "I haven't listened to a single one of your songs, but I need content for my segment," and ask, for the 14th time that week, whether any of the members have a crush on Ariana Grande. And then having to turn to Yoongi, to Jungkook, to Taehyung and translate that question while keeping your composure intact, while maintaining the diplomatic poise that your company expects, while representing not just yourself, but your group, your label, your country, and an entire genre of music that the Western media was only beginning to take seriously. RM did that. Repeatedly. Without breaking. But there were moments, and they are all documented, all captured on camera, all dissected by armies with the forensic precision that this fandom has elevated to an art form, where the mask slipped. One incident that army historians reference frequently occurred during a radio interview with a major American station in 2017. The female host, visibly uninterested in discussing BTS's music, spent the majority of the segment asking the members to rate each other's looks, demonstrate ijeo, a Korean term for a cutesy. Exaggerated display of affection common in Korean entertainment, but deeply contextual and often infantilizing when demanded by someone who doesn't understand the culture and perform what amounted to tricks. Dance for us. Say something cute. Do the thing that makes your fans scream. The subtext was unmistakable. You're not artists, you're entertainment. You're not here because you've created something meaningful. You're here because you're exotic and your fan base is loud enough to warrant airtime. Namjoon translated every request. He performed every trick. He smiled through every question. But in a fan cam captured by armies outside the station after the interview, Namjoon was seen walking to the group's vehicle with the expression that fans who had studied his face for years immediately recognized. The quiet devastation of a man who had just spent 45 minutes having his life's work reduced to a sideshow. He didn't say anything to the fans who greeted him. He waved. He smiled briefly. He got in the car. And that was it. But the cumulative toll of these interactions extended far beyond any single interview. What made RM's experience uniquely painful was the isolation embedded within it. The other members, shielded by the language barrier, experienced these dismissive interviews as awkward or boring, but rarely as personally offensive, because Namjoon, in his translations, consistently chose to protect rather than to expose. He softened the sharp edges. He reframed condescending questions as genuine curiosity. He carried the full psychic weight of the disrespect alone, distributing only the sanitized version to his teammates, because that's who Kim Namjoon is, a leader who would rather absorb the blow himself than let it reach the people he's responsible for. But absorption has a cost. And for Namjoon, that cost manifested in ways that became visible over time to anyone paying close attention. In his personal reflective content, the Mono mixtape released in October 2018, his Weverse posts, his museum visits that he documented with philosophical captions, a recurring theme emerged: the exhaustion of performing identity. The fatigue of being a bridge between cultures while standing in the middle of both and fully belonging to neither. "Sometimes I feel like I'm a machine," he said in a 2019 interview with Time magazine, an interview that, notably, was conducted by a journalist who actually asked substantive questions. "I translate the question, I think about the diplomatic answer, I translate my answer, and somewhere in that process, my actual feelings get lost." That quote didn't go viral in the mainstream press. But it reverberated through the ARMY fandom like a seismic event, because it articulated something fans had long suspected but never heard confirmed, that the smooth, confident RM who handled Western press with seemingly effortless charm was, internally, coming apart under the strain of being the sole human buffer between his group and a media machine that often didn't respect them. The gender dimension here deserves examination. Not because all female interviewers treated BTS poorly, many didn't, and some of the most respectful, insightful interviews BTS ever received in the West came from female journalists who had done their research and treated the group as the serious artists they are. But the pattern of reductive, crush-obsessed, performance-demanding interviews disproportionately came from female entertainment hosts, particularly those working in morning television and pop radio, formats where the editorial pressure to produce fun, light content often translated into treating male Asian artists as cute objects rather than creative equals. And RM, by virtue of his language ability, was the one who felt that objectification most acutely. He understood the words. He heard the tone. He caught the glance between the host and the producer that said this segment is filler. And he translated it all, swallowed it all, smiled through it all, because the mission was bigger than his feelings. The mission was always bigger than his feelings. What makes RM's story ultimately transcendent rather than merely tragic is what he did with the frustration. Number 2, the private world that was stolen and burned in public when his heart became everyone's headline. There are things in this world that are supposed to be sacred. Moments that belong only to the people living them, a quiet afternoon, a private smile, a photograph taken between two people who trusted that it would never leave the space it was captured in. For Kim Taehyung, the man the world calls V, that sacred space was shattered in a way so violent, so public, and so deliberately cruel that it didn't just change his relationship with fame, it changed his fundamental understanding of safety. And the weapons used to break him? They weren't wielded by tabloid journalists or paparazzi hiding behind telephoto lenses. They were wielded, amplified, and celebrated by women, thousands upon thousands of them, who decided that Taehyung's private life was community property, and that his happiness was a crime that deserved punishment. The timeline of what happened reads like a nightmare scripted by someone who understands exactly how to dismantle a person's sense of security one piece at a time. Beginning in late 2021 and escalating dramatically throughout 2022, private photographs of intimate, personal images that were never meant for public eyes began appearing on social media. Not blurry paparazzi shots taken from across the street. Not ambiguous images open to interpretation. These were private photos. Close range. Personal. The kind of images that exist on someone's phone, in someone's cloud storage, in the digital spaces that modern humans treat as extensions of their most intimate selves. And they were being leaked, systematically, by an anonymous account that operated with the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly how much damage each release would cause and timed them accordingly. The photos revealed what millions of fans had speculated about but never confirmed, that Kim Taehyung was in a romantic relationship with Jennie Kim of Blackpink, one of the biggest female K-pop artists on the planet. Under normal circumstances, in a rational world, two young, talented, successful people finding connection with each other would be cause for celebration, or, at the very least, a collective shrug of good for them. But the K-pop ecosystem doesn't operate in a rational world. It operates in a world where parasocial relationships are currency, where the illusion of availability is a contractual obligation, and where female fans, the demographic that drives album sales, concert attendance, streaming numbers, and brand endorsements, hold a kind of economic and emotional leverage that can make or break careers overnight. And when those female fans saw the leaked photos of Taehyung with Jennie, saw him smiling, saw him relaxed, saw him existing in a private sphere that didn't include them, the reaction wasn't disappointment. It was detonation. The online firestorm that erupted across Twitter, Weverse, Pan, Instagram, TikTok, and every other platform where K-pop discourse lives was unlike anything the fandom had experienced before. And this is a fandom that has weathered military enlistments, contract negotiations, and a global pandemic. The fury came from multiple directions simultaneously, creating a perfect storm of toxicity that engulfed Taehyung from every angle. First, there were the female BTS fans, specifically, the solo stans and Akis who viewed Taehyung as theirs, who reacted to the relationship confirmation with volcanic rage. Their social media posts used language that oscillated between heartbroken and threatening, framing Taehyung's decision to have a girlfriend as a personal betrayal equivalent to infidelity. "How could he do this to us?" became a refrain so common that it stopped sounding absurd and started sounding like a genuine belief system. A worldview in which a 26-year-old man's romantic choices required the approval of millions of strangers who had never met him. Second, there were female fans from rival fandoms, particularly segments of Blackpink's fandom, Blink, who attacked Taehyung from the opposite direction. Rather than being angry that he was dating, they were angry about who he was dating, framing Jennie as somehow too good for an idol from another group, or accusing Taehyung of using the relationship for clout, or, in a particularly twisted inversion, blaming him for the invasion of Jennie's privacy as if he had orchestrated his own humiliation. Third, and this was perhaps the most insidious layer, there were the female content creators, fan account operators, and self-appointed investigators who treated the leaked photos not as evidence of a crime, but as content to be analyzed, zoomed into, cross-referenced, and distributed as widely as possible. They created threads. They made comparison posts. They geolocated backgrounds in the photos to identify where Taehyung and Jennie had been. They turned stolen moments into a forensic exhibition, all while positioning themselves as neutral reporters just sharing what's out there, as if the ethical dimension of amplifying illegally obtained private photographs was someone else's problem. The sheer scale of the harassment was staggering. At the peak of the leaks, Taehyung's name trended worldwide on Twitter not because of his music, not because of his artistry, not because of anything he had created or contributed, but because his privacy had been annihilated and millions of people, predominantly women, were feasting on the wreckage. Hashtags demanding he explain himself trended alongside hashtags mocking him, alongside hashtags psychoanalyzing his relationship, alongside hashtags that simply existed to generate engagement from his pain. And through all of it, through every leak, every trending topic, Every cruel post, every dissected photograph, Taeyong said nothing. Not a word. Not a statement. Not a cryptic social media post. The silence was deafening, and in its own way, it told the story more powerfully than any press release could have. It was the silence of a man who understood that anything he said would be weaponized, that any defense would be twisted, that any acknowledgement would fuel the very machine that was grinding his personal life into content. His company, HYBE, maintained a similar posture of restraint, issuing only the most minimal statements, a posture that, depending on your perspective, was either a strategic decision to let the news cycle exhaust itself or an institutional failure to protect one of its most valuable artists from an unprecedented invasion of privacy. What makes Taeyong's story particularly devastating is who he was before the leaks and who he became after. Before 2022, V was arguably the most openly emotional and freely expressive member of BTS. His social media presence was a window into a genuinely artistic soul. He posted photos of sunsets, paintings he admired, songs he was listening to, jazz playlists curated with the care of a sommelier selecting wine. His V-Lives were legendary for their warmth and spontaneity. He would go live at 2 in the morning just to talk to fans, play saxophone, or sit in comfortable silence while reading comments. He treated the fan-idol relationship with a tenderness that was rare even by BTS standards, often speaking about ARMYs as if they were family rather than consumers. After the leaks, that openness contracted visibly. His social media activity decreased dramatically. The spontaneous V-Lives became rare, then rarer, then almost non-existent. When he did appear in public content, there was a new guardedness in his eyes, a micro-calibration of every word, every expression, every gesture, as if he was constantly running an internal calculation about how each moment might be captured, distorted, and used against him. The man who once shared his inner world freely had learned, through the most painful possible lesson, that sharing meant vulnerability and vulnerability meant ammunition. Friends and collaborators who interacted with Taeyong during this period have spoken carefully, diplomatically, in the coded language that the K-pop industry uses to discuss emotional damage without creating new headlines, about a person who is processing something profound. Not anger. Not even sadness, exactly. Something closer to grief. The grief of losing something you can never get back, the naive belief that there are spaces in your life that belong only to you, that there are walls that cannot be breached, that there are people who will respect the boundary between the public persona and the private human. The women who leaked those photos, whoever they were, whatever their motivation, didn't just violate Taeyong's privacy. They stole his sense of self. They took the most personal, most human, most tender part of his existence and turned it into a spectacle for consumption. And the women who amplified, shared, analyzed, and weaponized those stolen images didn't just participate in the violation, they made it profitable. They gained followers. They generated engagement. They built platforms on the rubble of someone else's demolished intimacy. Taeyong's solo career continued to soar. His debut solo album, Layover, released in September 2023, was a masterpiece of quiet, atmospheric R&B that debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200 and showcased a vocal artistry so refined that critics who had previously overlooked him scrambled to recategorize his talent. The music survived. The art endured. But the boy who used to go live at midnight just to say, "I love you," ARMY, number 1 Jimin, the body that was never enough. Starved by words that came from women who called it love. This is the one. This is the story I've been building toward since the very first second of this video, and I need you to understand something before we go any further. This isn't just about a celebrity who got some mean comments online. This is about a human being who is systematically, relentlessly, and publicly dismantled from the outside in, piece by piece, until the only version of himself he could see in the mirror was one that deserved to disappear. And the architects of that destruction? They weren't faceless trolls hiding behind anonymous accounts. They were women sitting behind television cameras with microphones pinned to their blazers. They were women typing comments from phones paid for by the same paychecks they spent on his concert tickets. They were women who looked at Park Jimin, one of the most breathtakingly talented performers to ever grace a stage in the history of modern music, and decided that the most important thing about him was the number on a scale. Park Jimin was born on October 13, 1995, in Busan, South Korea. Before BTS, before the screaming stadiums, before the solo album that would shatter records, Jimin was a contemporary dance prodigy. He attended Busan High School of Arts as a top student in the modern dance department, not as a casual participant, not as someone filling an elective, but as the #1 ranked student in his class. His teachers described him as once in a generation. His body was his instrument, and he played it with a precision and emotional expressiveness that made grown adults stop and stare. When he auditioned for Big Hit Entertainment and was accepted as a trainee, he brought that dancer's discipline with him, the obsessive perfectionism, the relentless self-criticism, the belief that every movement had to be flawless or it wasn't worth performing. That perfectionism, in the right environment, would have been channeled into artistic excellence and nothing more. But the K-pop industry in 2013 was not the right environment. It was a crucible designed to produce a very specific kind of idol, one that looked a certain way, weighed a certain amount, and presented a physical image so meticulously curated that it bordered on architectural. And Jimin, despite being a trained dancer with a physique built for performance, didn't naturally fit the template. He had a rounder face than some of the other members. His body carried weight differently, not excessively, not unhealthily, just differently. In any rational context, this would be a non-observation, a meaningless variation in human biology. But in the K-pop context, it became a target. And the women who pulled the trigger first weren't anti-fans or haters. They were female MCs on Korean television programs, professionals with broadcast authority, whose words carried the weight of institutional validation. The incidents are documented with painful thoroughness across fan archives, broadcast recordings, and social media timelines that stretch back to BTS's debut era. During variety show appearances in 2013, 2014, and 2015, female hosts made comments about Jimin's appearance that were framed as playful observations but functioned as precision-guided emotional weaponry. "Oh, Jimin, your cheeks look fuller today. Have you been eating well?" said with a laugh and a head tilt that transformed a seemingly innocent question into a public way and conducted under studio lights in front of millions of viewers. "You look different from your photo. The camera really does add weight, doesn't it?" Delivered with the practiced casualness of someone who knows exactly what they're doing, but has plausible deniability built into every syllable. Among the members, Jimin has the most, let's say, healthy physique, spoken with air quotes and a knowing glance at the camera that invited the audience to read between the lines, healthy meaning not thin enough, not sharp enough, not conforming closely enough to the razor-edged beauty standard that the Korean entertainment industry enforces with the merciless efficiency of a machine. Each comment, taken in isolation, could be dismissed as thoughtless, a slip, an awkward attempt at humor. But taken together, and armies have taken them together, compiling supercuts and timelines that lay the pattern bare with devastating clarity, they formed a sustained campaign of body commentary that no 20-year-old, no matter how strong, could absorb without damage. And Jimin absorbed all of it. Every word, every glance, every laugh track that followed a comment about his weight. He heard them. He internalized them. And then he did the thing that breaks my heart more than anything else in this entire list. He agreed with them. The evidence of what those comments did to Jimin's relationship with his own body is not speculative. It is documented. It is confirmed. It is spoken about, in Jimin's own voice, in footage that exists for the world to see, and that the world should never be allowed to forget. In the 2018 YouTube Originals documentary series, Burn the Stage, which followed BTS during their Wings tour, there is a scene that has become one of the most discussed and emotionally devastating moments in the history of K-pop documentaries. So here we are. 7 stories. 7 members. 7 wounds inflicted by women who occupied vastly different positions in these artists' lives: television hosts, obsessive fans, careless interviewers, anonymous hackers, cruel fan sign attendees, dismissive broadcasters, and an entire culture of body surveillance that treated a young man's flesh as public property. But if you strip away the individual details, if you zoom out from the specific incidents and look at the architecture of what happened, a single devastating truth emerges. Every one of these stories is, at its core, about the same thing: the weaponization of proximity. These women hurt BTS not because they were distant enemies. They hurt them because they were close. Close enough to sit across from J-Hope at a fan sign table and watch his smile fracture in real time. Close enough to hold a microphone 6 inches from Jin's face and reduce his entire existence to bone structure. Close enough to occupy the same studio as Suga and erase a decade of production work with a single careless sentence. Close enough to share Jungkook's flight, his phone number, his home address. Close enough to ask RM the same reductive question for the 100th time while looking him directly in the eyes. Close enough to steal V's most private moments and scatter them across the internet like confetti. Close enough to comment on Jimin's body with the casual authority of someone who believed his physical form existed for public evaluation. Proximity is supposed to be a privilege. In these 7 cases, it became a weapon. And the damage it caused wasn't superficial. It reshaped how these 7 men interact with the world. J-Hope's relentless positivity now carries an undercurrent of defiance, a refusal to let the rejection define him that is itself evidence of how deeply the rejection landed. Jin's humor has become armor, a shield so effective that most people forget there's a wound underneath it. Suga's production credits have become his rebuttal, a discography so vast that denial is no longer possible, but the fact that he needed a rebuttal at all is the tragedy. Jungkook's privacy has become a fortress, a walled garden built by a man who learned too young that openness invites invasion. RM's diplomacy has become a survival mechanism, a linguistic elegance born not from confidence, but from the exhaustion of translating his own dehumanization. V's spontaneity has become measured, the once free spirit now calculating every public moment against the possibility of exploitation. And Jimin's relationship with his own reflection has become a daily act of courage, a conscious choice to accept what he sees rather than starve it into someone else's ideal. But here's the part that matters most, the part that separates this story from a tragedy and makes it something closer to a testament. They're all still here. All 7 of them. Still creating, still performing, still choosing every single day to stand in front of the world despite knowing exactly how sharp the world's teeth can be. BTS didn't survive these women by becoming harder. They survived by becoming more honest with themselves, with each other, and with the millions of people who look to them not for perfection, but for proof that it's possible to be wounded and still whole, to be scarred and still beautiful, to be hurt by love and still believe in it. And that, more than any record, any award, any stadium filled to capacity, is why they matter. Not because they're untouchable, but because they were touched, deeply, painfully, repeatedly, and they kept going anyway. That's our list. 7 women. 7 wounds. 7 members who turned pain into purpose. If any of these stories moved you, if any of them made you think twice about the words you speak and the power those words carry, then this wasn't just entertainment. It was a reminder. A reminder that behind every idol, there is a person. And persons break. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the very end. And the next time you look at BTS, the next time you hear their music, see their smiles, watch them light up a stage like 7 human supernovas, remember what it cost them. Remember what they carried. And maybe, just maybe, choose to be the kind of person who makes the carrying a little lighter. This has been your list. And we'll see you in the next one.